news is that the speaker who should have been with us last month will be with us in July. So we wouldn't have had a meeting in July, but you will now, because the speaker that came last month couldn't come, so there you go. If it needs further explanation, I'll talk to you all afterwards. Yeah. Whilst mentioning speakers, next month on the 7th of March, here, 7 p.m, we've got Mike Blackburn, who's been here many times before, and he's going to talk to us about the narrow gauge tramways and railways in North Wales. There, I'm glad I got that out. There we go. And if you fancy an away day, on Saturday the 22nd of February at St Peter's Church, Holywell, at 2:30, Ken Pye will be talking about Titanic. So that's the 22nd of February, St Peter's Church, Holywell, 2:30. We've booked up the speakers until April next year. However, if you hear an interesting speaker, please let me know, and we can add them to the list of future possibles. Calendars, we almost sold out of 2025 calendars, but a little bit of market research. One or two people have said they would prefer something like that, so there's more room to write on, as opposed to that, which we've produced for the last few years. So without making a big thing of it, hands for that one? Hands for that one? Well, I think it's about even Stephen, actually. And those that didn't put their hands up obviously don't use a calendar, so there we go. Right. Okay, thank you for that. But anyway, we will go ahead with the calendar for next year. However, as you can imagine, it's getting more and more difficult with regard to photographs from our photograph even collection that are suitable for calendars. So, if any of you have got photographs of Rhuddlan hidden away in a cupboard or a drawer, and you think that they would be suitable for a calendar, please bring them along to the next meeting. We can copy them, and then you will get them back. So we're not going to keep them. So there we go. Julie, our researcher, has been busy with inquiries from Canada and France, both of which have resulted in generous donations to the Society. She has just received an inquiry about the courthouse in St Asaph. And also, if you've been to the library recently, you will have seen our cabinets with a World War II display. That was to coincide with last month's speaker. But as I said before, we didn't have a meeting. I'm not going to go there. Anyway, if you haven't been, go and have a look. Quite interesting. Julie is very busy. So Chris tells me. And mentioning Chris, he is our speaker for this evening. He's made the perilous journey from just up the road to be with us this evening. He's one of our members, and he's going to be talking to us about the Port of Rhuddlan Revisited. But I've given him some more information this evening, so perhaps in a couple of years' time we'll have the Port of Rhuddlan Revisited. Chris Grier.
First of all, can you hear at the back with this thing?
Can we lift it up a bit more, please?
Right, let's see where we go.
I did warn you.
I was told I could clear the room that way. That's exactly what I want. I hadn't, of course, I'd forgotten that we didn't have a speaker last month, did we? So in that case, I'm going to have to say Happy New Year, aren't I? You're with now with that. But anyway, just under 10 years ago, I gave my first talk, and it was to the Society, and the lights are going out. obviously seen the lighting bill. Everybody happy with the lights? Yes. Yes. That's good evening. So, just 10 years ago, I gave my first ever talk. It was to this society. The subject was Rhuddlan's maritime history. Some of you may actually have been there that night. Now, about a year ago, I was asked to revive it again. And I thought about it and decided to rework it, since I'd actually retired it by that stage. And there's additional research, and of course there's an extra 10 years life experience under the belt as well then. So I hope it won't disappoint. The aim of tonight's talk is to give a flavour for what has happened along the River Clwyd over the centuries, especially in Rhuddlan. In addition, I've broadened the topic to give it some context and flavour for what's happening elsewhere. I've included aspects of the growth of Rhyl as the stories of the two communities are linked closely together. There are many questions that can be asked of Rhuddlan as a port. Here are a few to get us started. Why Rhuddlan? What purpose did it serve? Why did the port cease to exist when it was once so important? Why did other ports survive while Rhuddlan didn't? Hopefully we'll have some answers by the end of the talk. Excuse me. Now,
excuse me, but could you speak either louder or turn the thing up, please? You're very softly spoken and your voice is not carrying.
is this? No. Now, our ancestors realised the best way to transport bulky goods was by water. Land travel could be slow and hazardous and was unsuited to larger, heavy loads. So it's no surprise that we find rivers and seas being used for these purposes, and the Vale of Clwyd is no exception. So the Vale extends for some 15 miles or so southwards from Rhyl down the Vale to Rhuddlan. It's protected from the worst of the weather by hills, which in turn are rich in minerals. It's blessed with fertile farmland, highly desirable place for our ancestors to live. Then added to this, historically Rhuddlan was the lowest crossing point on the River Clwyd before reaching the sea. Well, it's also on a ridge above the floodplain, and then we can see why Rhuddlan has been settled since prehistoric times. You will recall the excavations recently on Hylas Lane, where they uncovered 9,000-year-old Mesolithic stone tools for proof of how long our ancestors were in the area. So Rhuddlan is on the edge of Morfa Rhuddlan, which was once an extensive area of salt marshes, stretching from Abergele to the west, Prestatyn to the east, and stretching as far south as Port of Rhuddlan and possibly even St Asaph. There are at least 3 main river channels running through it, with many creeks and inlets. So it's a bit of a potted history of early recorded times in the area. So the Romans were here, of course. They were in Abergele, they had a military base. They were in Prestatyn too. The area rich in lead ore, and in the Prestatyn area, silver too. it's quite likely that the Romans transported minerals from the area by sea to their local capital at Diva, present-day Chester, and that was for greater ease and security rather than travelling overland. They definitely made use of the port in Prestantin. It's quite conceivable that Rhuddlan may have been used too, because they were known to have accessed the waterways of the Morva. Now, the post-Roman history of the Vale, and Rhuddlan in particular, was turbulent. Aside from frequent bickering amongst the rural houses of North Wales, the inhabitants had to do with unwanted interest from the Saxons in the east. So the Vale of Clwyd was key to political and military interests in North Wales, was hotly disputed. Rhuddlan will be of great strategic importance from Roman times through to the English Civil War in the 17th century. So we have Gruffydd ap Llywelyn, who was spoken of as the last true High King of Wales, had a llys, a fine palace, I guess, here from which he plundered Saxon lands as far away as Wrexham and Oswestry. But there was a price to pay for that. Border security on the Saxon side was under the hands of a certain heavy called Harold Godwinson, Earl of Hereford, a man later to become known as the last Saxon King of England. He led a surprise attack in Rhuddlan at Christmas 1063. Gruffydd only just managed to escape by boat from Rhuddlan, while the rest of his fleet and his llys were torched. So the river was being used by boats in the 11th century, and they may well have been some sort of quayside or jetty there. However, we can't see more than that, it's undocumented. The Normans made Rhuddlan the largest settlement in the Northern Vale, with a castle, a church, a mint, corn mills and fisheries too. Now, there wasn't much competition, frankly, because the area was pretty sparsely populated, mainly marsh and forest. I suspect there was little activity in Norman times on the local waterways, except for fishing. Geraldus Cambrensis, Gerald of Wales, noted that the Welsh involvement in maritime trade at his time was negligible. So, Rhuddlan emerged as a small but significant settlement, primarily due to its location, and Edward I's activities reinforced this. Edward's invasion of North Wales in 1277 was different from previous invasions. It was a combined operation with an army and a fleet. To consolidate royal power in North Wales, he seized strategic coastal locations, developed them into settlement towns supported by substantial state-of-the-art castles. Rhuddlan was an example of that. And here he ordered the construction of a castle complete with its own dock, protected by the formidable Gillet's Tower. And there was another small dock by the river gate too. Oh, sorry. So there's Gillet's Tower, and there's the river gate. So the construction work on the castle used limestone from the Bishop of St Asaph's quarry at Bonnawydd, close to the River Elwy. This was floated downstream, presumably on barges, rafts, possibly flat-bottomed boats. Its earliest mention of shipping upwards of Rhuddlan. Indeed, it's one of the few examples of it. And sandstone was also brought to the castle site by boat from Chester and Flint. Rhuddlan's new settler town was provided with a bridge to the west over the River Clwyd, probably a wooden swing bridge or a lifting bridge to allow ships to pass under to keep supplying the castle. So one interesting feature of the scheme stems from Edward's desire to have all his castles supplied by ship to prevent them being starved out in siege. And so he had the sluggish, winding, shallow River Clwyd transformed into a viable, safe navigation channel by straightening it for 2 miles down to the sea. Some 1,800 ditches diverted, canalised the river, created what was perhaps the first canal in Great Britain. It ensured that Rhuddlan Castle would be supplied at all times, and the strategy worked extremely well. Rhuddlan Castle was never taken in with the Welsh rebellions in the following centuries, even though the town itself was burnt down on several occasions. There must have been significant secure moorings along the river by now, as Edward based a fleet of about 40 ships and some 1,300 men in Rhuddlan during his second campaign in North Wales in 1282-83. So shipments to Rhuddlan at this time was primarily food for the military, although there was a special consignment of prunes delivered from Chester for the personal use of the Queen. She seems to have suffered from the effects of the rather rich but unhealthy diet that was available to her class at the time. Now, there's a tragic incident occurred in the winter of 1309-10, which cast some light on the trading activities of the area during the reign of Edward I. So by the early 14th century, North Wales was firmly under the control of the king and his nobles, and that included an English-style bureaucracy. That winter, a trading ship, possibly sailing from Anglesey to Chester, was washed up on the western side of the River Clwyd during a storm. 3 sailors were deposited on the shore. Then the ship was washed away towards the eastern bank of the river, where it was wrecked. There were no more survivors. The legal proceedings won't detain us tonight, but they do help to highlight that a number of the present-day settlements existed in the 14th century, such as Trellwelyn, Quiber and Cefndy, while the cargo of wood and herring showed that North Wales was involved in international trade. The legal proceedings were quite fascinating because the powers that be were squabbling over ownership of the cargo. They had no interest in the unfortunate crew at all. And the legal proceedings also showed how corrupt the authorities were, and that is definitely another story. They definitely had their fingers in the till. But the ship in question was probably a small one like this, called a cog. Cargoes would be brought to a hub, such as Beaumaris, where they'd be transported into smaller ships such as this, to be taken on to their final destinations. It was profitable trade, especially for the merchants, but it was dangerous work for the crews, as I think this unfortunate example shows. The ship was likely to have been small, heavily laden, cumbersome, with poor manoeuvrability. It was a tragedy waiting to happen. Was mirrored many times over during medieval times and later too, unfortunately. The trade could be international, as evidenced by the wine, possibly by the herring in the ship's hulls. Rhuddlan is mentioned at this time in a list of Welsh ports that had medieval trading links with southwest France and northern Spain. And this is a picture of the Newport ship. It's a 15th century vessel that was rediscovered in 2012. 80 foot long, capable of deep sea voyages. Incredibly, it was longer than most of the ships built on the River Clwyd in the 19th century, some 400 years later. So it was quite a sizable beast, that one. Now, the River Clwyd earned its keep by ensuring the safety of the royal garrison. Attacks by native population were seen off in the 1280s and 90s and the 1400s. Despite those blips, the thought of the residents turned increasingly to more peaceful occupations. As mentioned before, one of the reasons that the Vale of Clwyd was so desirable was the fact its farmland is very productive. I didn't actually say that before, did I? More peaceful times led to a growth in agricultural output, and then in turn it led to a surplus of crops, a surplus cash for the landed few. The cargoes carried on the river reflected changing times. In the 1270s and 80s, the cargoes were stone, imported for building the castle, as well as military supplies and provisions. More peaceful times, we see the development of an export trade in agricultural goods, such as butter, cheese, wool, beef and hides. The gentry could now afford high-status imports. Rhuddlan saw a trade in Spanish wines, spices, soap from Castile, figs, prunes, sugar and coal. And slates were being transported to Rhuddlan by the late 15th century, as well as salt from Cheshire for use in local herring trade. Quays, wharfs, warehouses probably developed along the river to handle this trade. Shipbuilding may have developed at this time too. But there was one change that peace brought, and that was to the bridge of the river. Originally of timber, the most important change occurred in 1358 when the first stone bridge was completed. So presumably after this, the castle could no longer be supplied directly to its own docks without first transferring cargoes to smaller craft to go upstream. So Rhuddlan was now primarily a trading port. Ships were based here by the late 14th century, if not earlier. There's a certain John to Helle who was recorded as owning the vessel. Intriguingly, a Flintshire man of the same name was recorded as being involved in the Rhuddlan rebellion before he was pardoned by the king in 1404. Could he be the same man? Move on to Tudor times, which is a time of profound change in Britain, and it involved improvements in financial and legal administration of the country. Control was passed to local levels, and that included the recording of coastal trade. The authorities decided to record this systematically. Until now, only overseas trades, have been monitored, while coastal traffic was allowed to go on its own sweet way. But they realised that some trade pretended to be coastal when it was actually going further afield. It was time for them to act against smuggling. They introduced the port's book system to Wales in 1559. It had been in use in England before that. And it was to record information on each individual voyage. That took a lot of effort. Even today, there are some 20,000 books still in existence. Heaven knows how many have been lost. Each area was allocated a head port to control the system. Some ports were less important than others, and they weren't recorded as fully. One such was Rhuddlan, which was seen as being little more than a creek, and Chester was its head port, which was curious, because Chester, of course, was English. And Conway was not allocated to an English port. However, it didn't really matter to the authorities at the time, because Henry VIII had actually abolished Wales by that point. But it would matter in the future. So by 1561, Rhuddlan is reported as a barred haven and a good creek, where is a noble castle of a king and well kept. The Vorid is also mentioned in the port's book at this time. A few years later, there's a document called The Havens and Creeks of the County of Flint, which is quite revealing. According to that, there are virtually no landing places in Flintshire and none at all in Denbighshire. I have a sense that the local gentry were covering up their maritime activities along the coast, if only to head off perhaps anticipated major workload. But we find the following in the documents. The Vorid is mentioned, and Rhuddlan is mentioned as having only 40 homes and with no boats there at all. I take that with a pinch of salt. So, what's happening locally at this time? Denbigh becomes preeminent in this century. It's significant for some time due to its market and the fact that it's a crown, part of the Crown estate. It grew in importance after the Acts of Union of 1530s and 40s, which made it the administrative centre of the new county of Denbighshire. It's now one of the largest towns in all of Wales, second only to Wrexham in the north, and Rhuddlan is its gateway to the wider world. 16th century sees wine, tar, pitch, iron being shipped to North Wales from places like Brittany, Spain, Ireland and Scotland. And it's likely that Rhuddlan is involved in this too, despite what that document said about being no ships there. Slates continue to be imported through Rhuddlan. Sir William Spen of Denbigh took delivery of no fewer than 13,000 of them in 1568. He was something of a tardy payer, however, so not certain yet whether he's paid off. One interesting import through Rhuddlan was that of Flemish bricks. They were transported to the Denbigh area for use in building the fine houses of Richard Clough, a local man made good on the continent. Clough came up with the idea of linking Denbigh to Rhuddlan by canal. Nothing came of the idea. Nothing came of the attempts to revive it in the 18th and early 19th centuries either. So, why didn't Rhuddlan develop the way that other places did? Denbigh has some fine buildings around the marketplace from this period, but Rhuddlan does not. The waterfront in Rhuddlan may have resembled that sort of scene there, but we certainly don't have any local to match the Tudor merchant's house that's in Tenby. So trade and port's ticking along, but we're told that Rhuddlan has about 40 households which are poor people. Seems any wealth generated locally is not trickling down the social ladder. Late 16th century, when it puts Rhuddlan into a sharp social context, it's reported that a ship loaded with grain from Rhuddlan was attacked by a hungry mob when it arrived at Conwy, and the mob was led by a priest. Interestingly, the local JPs looked rather sympathetically upon the rioters. Remember, Giraldus Cambrensis said in the 12th century that his Welsh contemporaries paid no attention to commerce, shipping or industry. It's certainly not the case by 1600. Welsh ports were increasingly active. Welsh merchants and mariners were able to exploit the same opportunities open to their English counterparts, thanks to the Acts of Union. It wasn't all bad. Rhuddlan plays its part in the 17th century too. North Wales, predominantly royalist in the early parts of the English Civil War. Rhuddlan becomes a supply base for the King's armies. It gives them access to the grain reserves of the Vale of Clwyd. Royalist fleet was stationed at Rhuddlan in 1645 with the intention of supplying Chester with wheat once the siege was raised. However, defeat at Broughton Moor near Chester put an end to that plan. The eventual defection of North Wales to the parliamentarian cause was a serious blow to the Royalists' northern aspirations. 17th century sees quite a trade in slate once again in Rhuddlan. Something of a recurring theme here. Bishop William Morgan took a delivery for the cathedral between 1601 and 4. Somewhat later, the cathedral took delivery of no fewer than 20,000 slates in 1682. In between, further deliveries were made to Rhuddlan in the 1630s of more than 60,000 slates. There was some quality building work taking place in the Vale that century, and Rhuddlan's helping it. So by the 18th century, we get an increasing amount of information available. The major exports now lead ore, timber, corn, with coal, manufactured goods and groceries being imported. Lead ore came from Dysart and Melodon, as well as mines around Abergele. These were shipped from Rhuddlan to Deeside for smelting. Rhuddlan also exported bricks to Abercegin, the old name for Port Penrhyn near Bangor. Now, where were they made? No idea. 1750s and 60s saw the importing of sizable quantities of iron pigs vicious series of robberies locally as an organised gang raided warehouses in both Abergele and Rhuddlan, made off with £600 of tobacco. Curiously, it's the only record I've found of tobacco in Rhuddlan. Now, Denby remains the largest, most important town in the Vale, but it's hampered by poor communications. Although the roads are going to improve this century. In 1758, the turnpike is authorised linking Denby and Rhuddlan. So that will improve communications between the pair of them. There's a further attempt to include Denby in the Industrial Revolution as well. A man by the name of Thomas Fitzmaurice bought Llywelyn Hall outside of Denby in the late 18th century, and he wanted to turn it into a major centre of the linen trade. He built the bleach works there. He imported brown linen through Rhuddlan from his estates in Ireland, and he hoped to finish them at Llywelyn. But the scheme failed, sadly, and he died heavily in debt. So, Rhuddlan has emerged the transport hub for the Vale, and it complements Denby as a Vale's market town. In this print, you'll see a small vessel there beside the bridge. I think it looks capable of passing under the bridge, in which case it will go upstream to St Asaph. And this is a scene looking the other way from the bridge. It's a sketch by Moses Griffiths, who's artist and chief to Thomas Pennant, local man of letters. Note that there is a quayside to the far end of the church, and there's a small building on the quay, possibly a warehouse. So that picture is from the final quarter of the 18th century. But all is not well in the Vale. So in the 18th century, Rhuddlan has a healthy trade in exporting grain. And through this, it becomes an important actor in social unrest in the area. So there are corn dealers in Rhuddlan who are known as badgers. And they buy directly from the farmers. And they found ready markets in the new towns and cities of northwest England, especially Liverpool, where they sell their produce then at premium rates to the detriment of local people in the Vale. Hoarding to increase prices is suspected. Added to this, the population grows in the first half of the 18th century, which puts pressure on food. And there are a series of bad harvests, 79, 29, 39, up that, and 94. These times, grains scarce and expensive. 1739, the harvest's poor. There's famine in the Vale and high mortality. That autumn, miners from Moston and Whitford raid a Liverpool sugar merchant's warehouse on North Rhuddlan. May 1714, North East Wales is in turmoil. Miners again lead a march on Rhuddlan demanding food. When none is provided, they ransack the granaries and the shops. Many buildings destroyed. There are riots up and down the road. There are similar scenes during the Napoleonic Wars as well, from the 1790s. April 1795, high food prices. Rioters attempt to loot ships' cargoes to prevent grain being exported. They return that November. It's the lead miners from Talagoch this time who leave the hungry mob there, and they manage to help themselves to the ship's cargoes. So food prices on the rise. The price of staple food, such as wheat and barley, more than doubled at Abergele Market between 1798 and 1800. Oats and potatoes rise substantially as well. At the same time, Acts of Parliament allowed the local gentry to drain, improve and enclose more of the Rhuddlan, which is common land at this point. So it's not a good time to be poor, I think. I hope this can be seen there. It's a sketch by Turner. It's a cracker. Sadly, it didn't translate into a painting. But it's got the usual beauty points, castle, church, bridge, but he's also sketched in a number of boats waiting on the tide. They would have made a lovely painting, but it certainly gives an idea of what things looked like in Rhuddlan at the end of the 18th century. So we move into the 19th century, and this is actually St Asaph in the 1830s. I'm not certain if you can see, there's actually a boat there. It's not standing out from where I am. But it shows that it's still possible to ship cargoes up the River Elwy to at least St Asaph. And the landing place by the bridge is, well, there's no trace of it now at all. Rhuddlan continues to develop as a port in the 19th century. There's improvements in the 18th and 19th century enabled much larger ships to be accommodated. In fact, it's claimed by 1798 that the quays extend for 100 yards on both sides of the river, and they can accommodate 100 ships at a time at any stage of the tide. I think that's a little bit of PR there. It's a bit of a tall story. But the quays have spread along the river. There's one by the bridge, another as an early print showed, to the north by the church. On the western bank, there's one by the tannery, and there's notably one by the foundry. The foundry seems to have been there from about 1815 in a small capacity, and it specialised in mechanical repair work, probably provided small items such as nails to the local shipbuilding industry. It made use of iron ore from Abergele area, and the port brought in coal and moulding clay for it, moulding sand, I beg your pardon. The port misses out on the heyday of the foundry, which doesn't occur until it's taken over by John Williams in 1860. So lead ore from Talagoch continues to be exported from Rhuddlan, and Rhuddlan has become now the primary corn exporting port in the whole of North Wales, shipping more corn than the rest of the ports combined. As well as having limestone quays here, well, one here still exists actually, there is an interesting three-storey building, which I'm guessing has got to be a granary or a general warehouse. Now, a further sign of the strength of Rhuddlan in the 19th century came when it's named as a bonded timber warehouse in 1841. There are records of timber imports and exports, both to Rhuddlan and the Vorid at this time. Pine, birch, elm, oak coming in. There are many adverts in the Chester newspapers and beyond for the sale of oak from sites in the Vale as well. So there's a significant timber industry. Another cargo arrives in 1838. Yes, it's slates again. 69,000 of them. 2 tons of them arrive in a coal yard. Where they go, I haven't the faintest idea. But there's a significant international event in the 1840s that affects Rhuddlan and the Vale, and that's the abolition of the corn laws. And this opens the way for a glut of wheat and similar produce from the USA especially, and it depresses the prices, the produce prices here, to the extent that by 1850 local prices of wheat, barley and oats were less than half the price they were in 1800. So it's great for the consumer, but not so good for the producers, and I suspect it has an adverse effect on the exports of these commodities through Rhuddlan. So things beginning to change rapidly in the outside world. Chester to Holyhead Railway opens in 1848, and that required a bridge to be built across the River Clwyd at Rome to accommodate it. While it would open to allow shipping to come up the river to Rhuddlan, the entire operation delayed vessels and trains by up to half an hour. It was inconvenient for the railway company, and so it eventually becomes a fixed bridge by 1880, which would be to the detriment of the port. 19th century also sees the start of a tourist road. North Wales had already been discovered by the gentry. Now it was visited by increasing numbers of ordinary folk. The first service starts up in 1821, and by 1825 there's a service from Parkgate on the Wirral, all along the coast and up the river to Rhuddlan. Steamships may have been noisy and unreliable in the early days, but they were less prone to delays caused by weather, and they offered a regular timetable. So by 1830, steamships were bringing cargoes as well as passengers, especially visitors. And they were bringing them to Rhyl and also to Rhuddlan if the tide permitted. So by the 1840s, Rhyl had become the major destination for these boats, and Rhuddlan would have its last recorded steamer in 1844. It's now becoming Rhyl's turn to shine. 1800, it's a place of small fishing boats, mean little cottages. As tourism increases, fishing decreases, and the accommodation there gets rather grander. This lovely hand-coloured engraving dates from 1856, and little really has changed in the last 150 years. It seems to be a nice sleepy backwater. There's some activity, not too much. All the ducks are lined up nicely. There's little to disturb the tranquility of the scene. But a report from a few years before on the state of the river and the Vorid harbour states that silting was making the river unnavigable. Work was needed to deepen, scour and straighten it to preserve the Vorid harbour and improve navigation to Rhuddlan. However, there seems to be little appetite to revive Rhuddlan. Through the 19th century, there were a number of merchants in Rhuddlan. Rhuddlan handling timber, slate, coal, even salt. Coastal trading vessels still reign supreme, but frankly not for much longer. And the tranquility won't last. Just 2 years after this print, in 1858, the Vale of Clwyd Railway opened. Change was profound. The port's role as a transport hub, the pass of the railway almost overnight, would have serious consequences to local employment. There's sailors, shipbuilders, quayside trades, local carters, carpenters, joiners, blacksmiths and innkeepers. But unfortunately for them, Rhyl was opening up and many made the short journey to the coast for work. But the port soldiers on, 1881, census day, there are still small ships, 4 ships, I should say, recorded as being there. Now, I have touched on shipbuilding, and I'm going to say a little bit more of it here. So from 1830, for about 50 years, there's a general expansion in trade. It led to an increase in shipbuilding. Trade was some importance to Rhuddlan. It was never a big player, but Rhuddlan and the River Clwyd earned a reputation for quality. It's common for ships to be financed locally until the mid-19th century, often by those who build them, or those who make them find them most useful, such as farmers, merchants, basically anyone with some spare cash as well. Often clergy and people called druggists, which I take to be pharmacists. The first recorded ship built in Rhuddlan was 1767. Mysteriously, it was labelled as being built for the smuggling trade. Bit of a giveaway, that. And so the earliest vessels on the River Clwyd were built in Rhuddlan, but by 1842 it's moving towards Rhyl on the Forrid. And this particular shipyard is actually in Porthmadog area, but it's going to be very similar to what we've had. We are short of images for this area, not necessarily these ones, because these are Robert Jones's. He started building in Rhuddlan in 1842. He built a schooner called the Rhuddlan Trader, and he was to become the main builder on the River Clwyd in the 19th century. Starting off in Rhuddlan, he moves his shipyard to the Forrid around 1857. So this slide shows that picture from the 1860s and the other two from about 1900 from the Forrid side. Business flourished at that site. Many found works in the art. His son, also called Robert, went into the business as well. Rhuddlan ships tended to be smaller than Rhyl ones. The river is a wee bit more less room, is what I'm trying to say there. Yes. So in Rhyl they're up to 110 feet in length. Many ships were built here, not all sold from Rhuddlan. Many spent their entire working lives, in fact, away from the River Clwyd, built for outside owners. Shipbuilding on the Forrid continued until about 1880. All the vessels were wooden sailing ships, except, rather curiously, one built in 1911 there was a 20-foot pleasure boat complete with a 1 horsepower engine. Put. I have no pictures of Robert Jones, the shipbuilder, but what we do have is in fact the first 2 items are from a document that relates to the building of a Rhuddlan ship called the Margaret and Anne in 1855 from Mr. Martindale of Liverpool. It's brought to my notice by my wife Julie in the background, so thank you very much for that. We certainly know how to have fun, don't we? Yes. I mean, one thing it does highlight is the lovely handwriting he's got, a tribute to 19th century education. Third document is a survey report on the same craft. The assessor is well satisfied with what he found. Robert Jones's son, also called Robert, I shall call him Robert Jr. There is an obituary in the Real Journal in January 1905 recording the death of Alderman Robert Jones, shipbuilder of Brigadon, Wellington Road, Vorrid. Succeeds his father as a shipbuilder. He expanded the building, and he actually provided one glorious flourish of activity beside the River Clwyd before its final extinction. He was a man of means. He was on the old board of commissioners, county councillor, represented the South Ward of the real UDC, Rhuddlan Marsh Embankment Trustee. This photo is for the Real Improvement Commissioners in 1894 when they were being disbanded and Real Urban District Council was established. I have no identifiable photos of Robert Jr. I'm hoping he is one of the fine gentlemen here, and I'm hoping he's not the one whose face has been obscured there. There is a story there. So, his father started as a ship's carpenter in Rhuddlan. He then starts repairing ships, and as I say, 1842 he builds a ship. By the time they move to Rhyl, both the Roberts are recorded as shipwrights. By 1871, Robert Jr. is employing 15 men and a boy, and that's a high point of the shipyard. It does decline, and Robert Jr. turns his hand to other activities, allied trades such as ship repairs and braking, and he's active in dredging Rhyl Harbour. The intention is to supply gravel raised to Liverpool for use building the docks. He did run into local objections in the form of court injunctions in the 1890s, attempting to prevent him from dredging because of the damage that was caused to the surrounding land, or at least the fear of such damage. They did, of course, launch the ships when they built them. And launching ships was a festive occasion. Crowds would turn out in their finest to see it. And it was recorded in the local newspapers. On the River Clwyd, the slipways were up to 70 yards long, and they were they used cartloads of grease to help ease the ships into the water. So we're fortunate we have newspaper reports of these events. Not all of them went according to plan. So there's the first launch of June 1857, an unidentified ship went aground and was later refloated. There was a critical account of it in the Real Record and Advertiser. There must have been words behind the scene because the following edition contained this. I think the apology is so good I'm going to read it out. In describing the above, we are sorry that our reporter rather hurriedly attributed the failure on the first attempt to mismanagement. It appears from explanations afterwards given that it arose from no mismanagement whatever, but from an accident over which there could be no control. And I really wish I thought of that as an excuse in my project management days. It's not my fault, it's beyond my care. So, many types of sailing ship are available. Type chosen would depend upon the nature of the work. I did a survey of locally built ships, and the most requested were schooners, which made up almost half of them, and a quarter of them were also boats called flats, which not surprisingly have flat bottoms. Both developed in the 18th century. The schooner increasingly became the versatile workhorse of choice. It could travel further out to sea. Those in the River Clwyd had 2, possibly 3 masts. American ones had up to 7. They dwarfed ours. The flats ticked along quite nicely. They were widely seen along the coast of Britain and on inland waterways as well. They did a lot of good, quiet services. So we have schooner, flat, can't remember, snow, ketch and sloop. And in the interest of fairness, other ship types were also available. Now, who owns the ships? So, up to the mid-19th century, many crafts were financed locally. And here's a list of the initial owners of a Rhuddlan ship called the Catherine Maria, built in 1856, and she was named after one of the owners, by the looks of it. So, since Elizabethan times, it was customary for ships to be split into 64 shares. So Tottenham's up and you should get 64. Individuals could own any number. So issuing the shares spread the cost and the risks as well as the profits. And they could also be traded. 6 years later, the local papers offer shares for sale in the Charlotte and the Catherine Maria here, both Rhuddlan ships. I wanted to tell you something about the local personality while we're at it. Again, there is no picture, but it should come as no surprise. It's no surprise, perhaps, to learn that Rhuddlan produced a significant number of ship's captains, given the number of sailors here. One such was a John Griffiths. He was born in 1824 in Rhuddlan. His father was the ship's master. It seemed quite natural that he and his brothers should also follow Dad to sea. 1841, the family are living in Oven Street, which is the old name for part of Parliament Street. And so that's a picture of Big Edin Terrace on Parliament Street. They probably lived in one of those houses. John Griffiths eventually lived in the far one there, Big Edin House. 1851, he's a ship's captain, married with one or two children. And by 1861, he has 4 children now, and they're still in Oven Street. and he takes command of a ship called the Studley, which is a new ship built in red by Robert Jones, based in Liverpool, owned by Aon & Co, and it's a firm with which John Griffiths would be associated for many years. So he remains 8 years with the Studley, working in coastal trade from Liverpool. During this time, he sails frequently to Ireland, to southern Scotland, including Creetown. Remember that name? Creetown supplies granite sets, granite blocks, for use in the construction of docks in Liverpool. It must have been very lucrative trade because of the number of voyages that are made there. After 8 years, he leaves the Studley, but in March of the following year, she's posted as missing with the loss of a crew of 3. That includes a certain Thomas Griffiths of Rhuddlan, who may well have been John Griffiths' eldest son. It's a sad, but not, it's far from uncommon occurrence in the sailing community. He takes command instead of a ship called the City of Perth, which is shipping granite sets from Creetown. But then he moves on to this one. And this is his final command, the Begetting. She was far from the largest vessel from the River Clwyd at just 93 tons, but she represents the majority of vessels built there, or was one of many that gave very good service during her working life. Again, she's registered in Liverpool. She spends much of her early trading life shipping coal from Mostyn Point of Ayr, and even from Swansea, where she trades with Ireland and returns with butter. Imagine cleaning the hold after those cargoes. Coal and butter. Oh, sorry, she also involved in transporting granite blocks from Crete. And there we are. We can't get away with that one, can we? Now, she's eventually sold to Scottish owners called Shaw from the Isle of Whittle in southern Scotland, where she continues one more time to carry granite to Liverpool. Yes, she has an eventful and very bruising life involving many manuscripts, frequently in Creetown, which seems to have been a very difficult port at the best of times. Her luck runs out on a stormy August night in 1907 in the Mersey estuary when she's run down and sunk by a steamer that doesn't seem to have stopped. A lifeboat's launched and they can't find the ship or the crew, but they're quite resourceful and they escape in their own boat and make it to New Brighton. So this picture is a genuine picture of the ship. Cutting a long story short, I believe my Scottish grandfather ran away to sea on this very ship from a small home village in southwest Scotland when it was owned by the Shaws, the Scottish family. So basically, he joined the ship that was previously owned by Captain Griffiths of Parliament Street, who lives across the road from my present home. So how's that for a coincidence? The sketch is by my grandfather. He would become an accomplished maritime artist thanks to the Depression in the 1920s and 30s. I appreciate I've got time issues here, haven't I? What I will do, I think, is jump on to this one and give an example of another working life of a curiously named ship called the Neophyte. The name means someone who has recently been involved in an activity and is still learning it. Now, what it says about the owners, I can't imagine, but again, built in the Forrid, 95 tonnes, average size for River Clwyd. She had a short, highly unusual working life. Her maiden voyage was to Tampico in Mexico, and under Captain Casson. When she returned, she had a cargo of Mexican fibre, which was put up for sale. Apparently Tampico fibre was made from plant fibres, was in demand as a substitute for animal bristles in the manufacture of brushes, cords, lariats, quality ropes used with horses, and when it's wrapped with thread, parallel bundles of fibre were used as the boning in corsets. Yes, that's a pretty horrific image, that, isn't it? I think we'll pass on. So they discharged the cargo, crew suitably refreshed, Neophyte puts to sea again, April 1858, destination Matacon, an island off the coast of Guinea in West Africa. She arrives there in July. No, beg your pardon, she leaves there in July with a general cargo of 7 passengers. Just 2 weeks later, she returned to Matacon. The unfortunate Captain Casson was dead, most of the crew were dead, all of the passengers dead, result of jungle fever, presumably a severe form of malaria. The ship was sailed back to Matacon by what reports call 2 native seamen, so presumably they had immunity to the disease. So this is a real problem for sailors at the time, because before there was effective medication, they just had no immunity to these diseases. Astonishingly, just 3 weeks later, a new crew has been assembled under a Captain Kidd, and they put to sea again. I wouldn't want to be there. Within a few days, Captain Kidd and the mate are dead. The ship's wrecked on reefs. The remaining crew attempt, well, they say to return with her, but I can't tell whether that's Matacon or Liverpool. It's unclear. But the whole thing I find suspiciously odd, and it's an extremely tragic end to her career. Many local built ships did sail beyond British coastal waters. The city of St Asaph, which is not actually pictured here, went under Captain David Jones, who is pictured. They went twice on epic voyages to Australia, as well as Canada, West Africa, most countries in South America, Puerto Rico, Guam in the Pacific. She's finally lost off South Africa when a cargo of coal catches fire. Other ships from the river, Clwyd, make it into the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean. One unfortunate ship, called the William George, is sunk by a U-boat off the French coast in 1960, not 1919. That would be a bit of a shock, wouldn't it, after the war had ended? So, that's the definition. Vorid, the term comes from the Welsh for estuary. So I think that fits a real harbour well. Rhuddlan, the original port, Vorid, we know of since the 14th century. As I mentioned, Rhuddlan was a tiny fishing hamlet at the start of the 19th century. Major trade changes see an increase in the tourist trade, which was much safer and I think financially more rewarding employment than was the fishing before. Packet boats ran along the coast originally, intended for quick cargoes, but then the canny operators realised they could move profits by bringing passengers as well, and a guaranteed round trip. So before it develops, we have Robert Jones on the roadside in the shipyard, and on the far side we also have the timber merchants appear. But the final days of the shipyard, you'll recall that the work tailed off quite rapidly, and it became into the hands of a fairly disreputable pair called Captain Hawthorne and Mr. Horton, both of whom had had clashes with the law and the local council. I won't say too much about this unhappy episode, but they attempted to demolish an old warship using explosives, which caused a certain amount of damage to neighbouring properties and wasn't well received. And this boat here, the city of Ottawa, they brought into willful dismantling, and they just left it to rot away and sink in the mud, where it remains today beside what is in the Dragon's Bridge. And that's there a few years ago. The timber yard, a much better experience. Originally, it was founded in the mid-19th century by John Evans. Charles Jones was the brother of Robert Jones the older. He had many interests. Master mariner, timber and coal merchants in Rhuddlan. He became a local farmer as well. And he took over John Evans' business in 1877. The site very handily benefited from a railway siding connected to the main line railways. So they received shipments of timber and the sawmills from Scandinavia, even Russia, served by steamships too, although Rhyl would be the site of one of the last shipments by sailing ship on the North Wales coast during the 1950s, when a consignment of timber arrived. Imported brick and cement too, and they closed in 1988, and I didn't even notice. Today, there's not a great deal left. CPAT, Clwyd and Powers Archaeological Trust, identified 2 quays, 3 wharfs and a warehouse associated with the port, but I believe only one of the quays and 2 wharves still exist, which you'll recognise that one, I think, there. And by the caravan site, it's the old tannery site. Have I got time? Have I got time to smuggle? Go walk around. So, in Saltmarsh days, Port of Rhuddlan was a suitable place in which smugglers could operate, goods coming mainly from the Great Orme. Obvious purpose of smuggling was to bring goods into the country that were either heavily taxed or banned. 18th century, half of all brandy and tea consumed was smuggled. The main beneficiaries would be, of course, the gentry who consumed these items, although the locals would also get their cut, which very nice too. They also smuggled lace, silk and tobacco. So North Wales is blessed with many inaccessible nooks and crannies. Smuggling centred to the west of where we are here. Wreckers were supposed to operate around Abergele as well. Port of Rhuddlan seems to be the secondary base when things got a bit too hot elsewhere. It was also used as a distribution centre. So I mentioned there was a 1767. There was a boat built for smuggling. It only lasted 2 years because it was caught by the authorities of the Cumbrian coast. But that's 1767. There's a report that a Liverpool cutter like that landed an illicit cargo in a curious combination of places: South Wales, Anglesey and Rhuddlan Marsh. And to quote, and I can't remember the source, they audaciously set 20 men on shore, well armed, to make good the landing and offered to send a guard further into the country if required. So they seem to be able to operate with impunity. The Coast Guards did manage to pick out 1,400 weight of tea, but I'm not certain where they got that from. So the slide shows a cutter, devised in the 18th century for speed. It started out in legitimate trades, but the smugglers quickly adopted it as a craft of choice. In turn, the excise picked up on it, and they began using them too. So the artful criminal is able to stay one step ahead of the law at that time. Smuggling died out, partly because of lowering or abolition of a lot of the duty, partly because after the Napoleonic Wars, there were a lot of soldiers and sailors who were looking for employment, and they were snapped up by the excise because they knew how to handle themselves in these situations. So the excise suddenly became very professional. And also, interestingly enough, it's perhaps the rise of Methodism, in which crime was not seen to be a very good thing to be involved in. So perhaps that has an effect as well. Yeah, that was an increasingly rushed trip. I did warn you, Richard, I haven't managed to get it down to 3 hours, but it's expanded again. So, Port of Rhuddlan owes its existence to its location. Initially, it's strategic and military. By the 14th century, it's becoming a transport hub for the Vale and Fluid, especially the northern end. It serviced the needs of the Vale. It wasn't tied to any particular industry for its existence, unlike, say, the slate ports in Gwynedd. It had serious weaknesses, and these were exposed quite starkly from the mid-19th century. So, silting of the river, arrival of ever larger vessels, emergence of rail as a more convenient location, and the coming of the railways. So it all combines to put an end to Rhuddlan's maritime story. More industrial ports boomed in the late 19th, early 20th centuries as their industries peaked, but most of them have gone now, the way of Rhuddlan. It's only Mostyn and Holyhead that have adapted to the needs of the 21st century. And I have some serious doubts about Holyhead at the moment. It is looking a bit shaky at present. So, I think Rhuddlan, quite amazingly, served its communities for over 1,000 years, which is far longer than most local ports did, considerably longer than the railways that superseded it. So I think that's not a bad epitaph for a little port that punched well above its weight for so long. And my apologies, it got increasingly rushed there. But thank you very much.